And there's got to be much more transparency than there is at the moment about where tax actually falls and who it falls on. I think there's very little understanding, for example, about the incidence of consumption tax and the fact that those taxes tend to be very regressive, and the burden of taxation over time, it seems to me, has fallen increasingly on the people who are least able actually to pay it. But I accept that maybe not everyone will agree with the idea that taxation has got to be progressive. People will have different views about that, but at the very least we've got to make sure that it's more transparent than it is at the moment. At the moment we have a breakdown from the government on how the budget is spent in general. I mean, that budget is being contested by lots of people, and I would contest it because it does things like lump pensions in with other kinds of social spending, so people think there's a huge amount of money being spent on unemployment benefit and welfare when actually most of it's on pensions. So that is problematic, I think, how it's broken down, but at least people get that breakdown of the budget, but they don't get a breakdown annually of the incidence of tax. They don't get a clear indication generally of how much someone like them ends up paying compared to people in other situations, what the contribution of different types of tax is, and they certainly don't get any information about where tax reliefs fall either. It seems to me that there are some kinds of very specific tax relief that surely we should be quite open about, and policymakers should be thinking very carefully about whether a tax relief is really the best way to deliver a public policy outcome, and whether spending might not be, traditional government spending might not be a better way of achieving that outcome, that's much more open, that's transparent, that's debated, that's discussed in the House of Commons, in a department in particular, that will be scrutinised by a select committee that relates to that department in a way that really tax reliefs aren't. I think it'll be really interesting for us to consider how other countries look at these matters, and actually when it comes to trying to have greater scrutiny of fiscal issues, tax and spending issues, that has happened within the European system with what's called the European semester. So now every country's got to submit its budget to the European Commission. That's then debated. I'm part of the process of debating that as well within the European Parliament. Britain opted out of that. Obviously we're leaving the EU, but it was quite a good option to debate and discuss different issues. So perhaps we need to think about, well, how could we have that kind of scrutiny in the future? Should the OBR, for example, the Office of Budget Responsibility, should it be doing an annual report on the use of tax reliefs? That was one suggestion that was made in the groups, and I think that's quite an interesting idea.